He thought it was just an ordinary beehive, but it turned out to be something very different. From that moment on, the farmer had to choose between his own life and the land he was trying to protect, and what he discovered inside changed everything. Watch the story until the end, and ask yourself what you would have done in his place. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Henry had lived on his land long enough to know every curve of the pasture, every shift in the soil, every season's change in the orchard that stood behind the barn like an aging forest of memory. He was not a man of sudden surprises. Life on a farm rarely allowed those days came measured by feeding time, by cloud patterns, by the rhythm of the cattle moving between shade and water. Even the oddities of nature, dead branches after storm winds, sudden burrows made by foxes, mushrooms appearing overnight like ghosts of rain fit within a familiar pattern. Nothing ever appeared without a reason. Nothing ever challenged his understanding of the land he had worked for nearly 20 years. That was why the thing hanging from the trunk of the old pear tree immediately unsettled him. It was early in the morning, the kind of dawn that looked washed in thin silver light, when Henry first noticed it. He had been walking the usual loop past the barn, across the chicken yard, and toward the orchard to check the irrigation lines. His dog trotted along beside him, nose down, tail cutting through the air in slow sweeps. The cattle were already nudging at the fences, waiting to be let toward the east pasture, where the grass still held moisture from the night. Everything was as it always was until his eyes caught the shape lodged against the trunk of the tree. He stopped, unsure what he was looking at. It was about the size of a large watermelon, bulging out from the bark as though the tree itself had grown a second crooked heart. At first glance, it looked like a hive, the kind that wild bees might build when they chose a tree instead of a wall or a human-made box. But the color was wrong, far too dark, almost like burnt wood. And its surface wasn't smooth or patterned like honeycomb. Instead, it was swollen and uneven, as if made from clumps of rough, layered matter pushed together with no symmetry at all. Henry took a few steps closer, studying it from a safer distance before trying anything reckless. It wasn't that he was afraid of bees. He had kept his own hives for years, and he respected them the way a man respects creatures that both feed you and can kill you if you are foolish. But this formation didn't behave like any hive he had seen. There was no cloud of busy workers swarming its entrance. No lazy drifting patrol around it. There was no visible entrance at all. In fact, the whole thing looked sealed. His first instinct was to explain it away. An abandoned nest, something that had formed and been left behind, maybe dried out or weathered. He tried to remember whether he had seen it the week before or even yesterday, but he couldn't, and that bothered him. You didn't just overlook something that large in a place you walk through every day. As he stood there listening, he noticed something else. A low hum, barely a sound at all, seemed to vibrate from the trunk. Not loud enough to be heard unless you were close. Not steady like normal hive buzz. It was pulsing almost like faint breathing. He held his breath, leaned in slightly, and heard it again. A muted vibration, not from insects outside, but from something inside the mass itself. The dog felt it too. She whined, backing away a few steps, her ears twitching in a way Henry had never seen in response to bees. She wasn't afraid of normal hives. She had wandered near his own bee boxes many times without concern. But whatever this was, she wanted distance. Still, he didn't touch it. Not yet. Instead, he stepped back, scanned the orchard, and tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The other trees held only branches, leaves, and late summer fruit. Nothing unusual. Nothing like this. The pear tree was one of the oldest on the property, thick in the trunk, nearly hollow inside. The kind of tree that should have been cut down years ago, but kept producing fruit out of stubborn loyalty. Perhaps some animal had chosen it as shelter, some creature he hadn't yet encountered. But even as that thought came, he felt the wrongness of it. No animal made a structure like this. It wasn't a nest. It wasn't a hive. It was something else. He walked the rest of the orchard, trying to put it out of his mind, but the image stayed with him the entire time. His cattle were restless when he let them into the pasture, moving with sharp jerks of their heads instead of their usual slow steps. One of the Jersey cows kicked twice at her own flank, as if irritated by something unseen. It was only when he got closer that he saw the small swelling under her hide one. Then another bee stings more than she should have gotten on a calm morning. The cow snorted and pawed at the grass as though she expected another attack. That was the first sign that something was wrong beyond the orchard. The second came when he returned to the yard and noticed the reduced activity around his own hives. Usually in late summer, the air above the wooden boxes hummed with purpose. Hundreds of workers coming and going in their endless loops, tending to brood and nectar and stored pollen. But now the flight paths were thinner and scattered. Many bees weren't returning. They were flying in a different direction toward the orchard. He knew it then, even before saying the words out loud in his mind. Something had drawn the bees away. Something had made them abandon efficient, structured work and choose something new, something they shouldn't be choosing. When the day warmed and the light turned gold against the barn wall, Henry walked back out to the pear tree again. He stood a little closer this time, studying texture and shape more carefully. The surface of the growth didn't just look rough. It looked layered, almost as though it had been built up piece by piece, but not in neat rows like wax, more like torn clumps that had been glued together with something sticky and then dried into hardened crust. Patches of yellow-gray dust clung to its lower edges, powdery and uneven. He leaned closer again, and the vibration rose just barely enough to feel felt more in his chest than heard in his ear. Bees weren't flying in and out like a normal hive. They were landing on the surface itself, walking across it, touching it with their legs and mouths, then flying off again, not carrying pollen, not returning with food. Instead, they seemed to be polishing the surface, spreading something across it. That was when the thought formed, unwelcome and cold. This wasn't a hive the bees had built. This was something else, and the bees were not using it. They were serving it. He stepped back slowly, the same way a man steps away from something he does not yet understand, but already knows is not harmless. He returned to the house and sat at the kitchen table with his notebook, writing everything down the way he always did when something went wrong on the farm. Size, shape, color, bee behavior, dog reaction, location, first sighting, potential risks. That was how he worked through confusion, not with panic, but with documentation. But even as he wrote, he knew there was no simple category to fit what he had seen. Not beehive, not fungus, not animal nest. Something in between, something that would not stay unknown for long. Because if it was what he suspected, it wouldn't stop at one tree. It would spread. And that was the first time a quiet fear surfaced, sharper than curiosity. Not because he felt in danger yet, but because he finally understood why the dog had backed away, and why the air had seemed slightly wrong around that pear tree. Something was living there, and it wasn't supposed to be. Something had taken his bees, and now it was starting to take the rest of his farm. And if he didn't act, it would take more. The hum from the orchard carried faintly through the open window as he sat there, pen still in hand, listening, realizing that the sound wasn't just in the tree anymore. It had already become part of the land. He just hadn't noticed it until now. And that was how the first day ended. With the knowledge that something foreign, something parasitic, something he did not yet have a name for, had entered the balance of the farm. And balance, once disturbed, never returns on its own. He would have to decide what to do. But first, he needed to know what it was. By the next morning, the pear tree no longer felt like just an oddity on the edge of the orchard. It had become a presence, something Henry could feel even when he wasn't looking at it. Something that kept returning to his thoughts no matter how hard he tried to focus on ordinary chores. He fed the cattle, checked the troughs, refilled the chicken feeders, and spoke to his wife about the day as if nothing was wrong. Yet, a quiet heaviness followed him everywhere. A sense that something foreign had been introduced into a world that was once predictable. He had lived long enough to know that when something on a farm made you uneasy, you didn't ignore it. You confronted it before it grew into something unmanageable. So after tending to the livestock, he gathered what he needed to inspect the strange mass again: work gloves thick enough to stop a sting, a long-handled knife, a folding saw, and a set of empty plastic containers he usually used for samples of soil or diseased bark. He didn't yet know what he was dealing with, but he knew better than to approach it unprepared. He moved the dog into the barn, closed the gate to the pasture so the cattle wouldn't wander close, and walked toward the orchard with the tools in hand, feeling the quiet cool of the morning settle around him. As he approached the tree again, he noticed something he hadn't registered clearly the day before. The bees weren't swarming around the mass the way they swarmed around a queen-right hive. They weren't bringing nectar and bulging saddlebags on their legs. Instead, they landed silently, walked over the surface of the formation, and then flew off with the same dust-like particles he had seen the evening before. Not pollen, not wax residue. Something else, something finer and duller, like powdered stone or ash. The pattern repeated itself over and over, like a wordless ritual. No pupa, no larvae cries, no honey scent, no sign of life being made. Only life being drawn into something that gave nothing back. He stood still for a moment, watching, memorizing every detail. Then he stepped forward slowly and without sudden movement, and lifted the gloved hand toward the surface of the mass. It was firmer than he expected, almost rigid, but not smooth. Under his palm, even through the glove, he felt a faint vibration, the same pulsing rhythm he had heard the day before. Except now up close, it didn't sound like bees. It sounded like something alive inside the material, something growing. He pulled his hand back and set the edge of the knife against the surface, applying pressure until the blade bit into the mass. Instead of crumbling like old wax, the surface resisted. He had to press harder, sawing with small motions until a section cracked and peeled away. That was when he saw the inside. There was no honeycomb, no hollow chambers, no organized cells. The interior was dense, made of tightly woven filamentous strands layered like packed roots or muscle fibers, and damp enough to glisten in the light. The moment the air hit the open section, a sour, loamy smell rose from it. The smell of deep soil, wet leaves, and something faintly chemical, like the underside of mulch mixed with metal. It was unmistakably organic, but not anything bees would ever build. It looked like the inside of a fungus. And as soon as he exposed that section, the bees reacted, not with disorganized panic, but with intent. They gathered in the air and landed not on him, but on the exposed wound in the mass, crawling over the fresh cut as though trying to seal it. Moving with precision, stroking their legs against the strands as if tending to them instead of defending themselves. For the first time since he approached the mass, a chill ran across the back of Henry's neck. Bees were not supposed to behave like caretakers to anything except their queen, brood, or hive. But here they were, treating this open section like a living organism that needed repairs. He didn't cut further. Not yet. He stepped back and waited until the bees settled, until the air stilled again. Then, with a deliberate motion, he cut a larger section, catching it before it fell, and placed it into one of the containers. It was heavier than it looked, far too heavy to be something dried or hollow. The weight alone confirmed that whatever this was, it wasn't dormant material. It was growing. He closed the lid, sealed it, and walked the sample back to the house. In his workshop behind the kitchen, he set the container on the wide wooden table he used for repairs and spread out newspapers beneath it. Here, under the lamp, he opened the container again and examined the fragment more closely. The outer surface was firm, shield-like, almost bark-like in texture, but the underside was spongier, layered with thin white filaments woven so densely that they formed a near-solid block. Tiny specks of yellow-gray dust clung to his gloves, and when he tapped a fingernail against the interior surface, faint moisture bled into the indentation. Fungal, not wax, alive, not abandoned. Parasitic, not symbiotic. He had seen fungi on trees before, of course. Shelf mushrooms, tinder fungus, chaga, velvet-toothed polypores. He could name a dozen without needing a field guide. But none of them pulsed. None of them attracted bees. None of them rewired the behavior of insects so fully that they became harvesters of its material. He lowered the lamp closer, watching how the filaments glistened under the heat, and noticed something else. The strands didn't just lay on the surface. They were fused into the wood grain of the pear tree, embedded like roots feeding from the trunk itself. That meant the organism was not only attached, but feeding, growing, spreading. It wasn't built on the tree, it was growing out of it. He checked his notes, pulled out a field book on fungal pathogens he had used years ago during a bout of root rot in the apple trees, and flipped through the pages. Nothing resembled what he had found. The closest comparison was a polypore fungus, but even that was too different. Wrong color, wrong structure, wrong interaction with surrounding life. When he leaned close, he noticed something else embedded in the filaments. Long hair-thin threads of a darker shade stretching through the mass, like veins. There was a rhythm to them, a faint twitching motion, as though they were reacting to the shift in temperature and air flow after being cut from the tree. The sight made his stomach tighten. He sealed the fragment back in the container, and wrote a single quiet line at the bottom of the page in his notebook. Not hive, not nest, fungus, bees working for it. Why? The question echoed inside him long after the words were written. He spent the next hour reviewing his notes from the previous day, cross-referencing observed behavior with known bee patterns. Everything pointed to one conclusion. This was not accidental. The bees were not simply investigating the growth out of curiosity. They were in service to it, drawn there by something chemical, biological, or instinctual, and acting with purpose. And if they were abandoning the real hives for it, then whatever this organism was, it exerted influence strong enough to override normal colony structure. That was not a small thing. Bees did not give up queens, brood, and hive memory unless something more powerful had taken their place. The certainty arrived slowly, not like shock, but like a cold, steadying weight in his chest. The thing on the tree was alive in a way no fungus should be, and it was no longer isolated. It had begun to change behavior patterns on his farm, and if it continued to grow, the bees would not be the only ones affected. Everything that depended on pollination, on calm livestock, on safe land. Even the humans living in the house would eventually fall into the range of whatever influence the organism held. The sun was beginning to lower outside, casting ribbons of red-orange across the fields. When Henry finally stood, sealed the container a second time, and placed it into a second, larger storage box. He marked it with the date and the word orchard sample A, and placed it on a high shelf away from heat and animals. He didn't know yet what he would do, but he did know one thing with absolute clarity. The time for passive observation was already ending. He would need to make a decision, study, report, isolate, destroy before the thing decided to spread on its own. Outside, the evening quiet settled over the farm, but the silence no longer felt harmless. It felt weighted, watchful, like the land itself was holding its breath. He looked out toward the orchard once more, seeing only a silhouette of the pear tree against the fading sky, but hearing in memory the low vibration he had felt beneath his hand, a vibration that was not going to stop. The bees were already choosing their allegiance, and whatever they had chosen was not supposed to exist. The next step would not be investigation. It would be containment. But before he could act, he had to understand what he was truly fighting, and there was still more to uncover. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that no longer felt like life on a farm, but like a waiting room before disaster. Nothing exploded into crisis. Yet, nothing improved. Every passing sunrise carried a new sign that the fungus and the bees were no longer merely an unusual event on the property. They were becoming a force the land was beginning to bend around. The longer Henry observed, the more he saw the pattern. This thing didn't conquer by violence. It conquered by quiet, persistent influence. The kind that made a man second-guess what counted as danger until it was too late to reverse. He began with research, not speculation, not fear, but methodical investigation. Every night after the chores were finished, he sat at the kitchen table surrounded by books, field guides, and old agricultural journals. His notebook filling page after page with sketches of fungal structures, bee behavior records, and timelines. He cross-referenced everything he could find related to parasitic fungi and insect manipulation. There were cases small and rare of fungi that released pheromone-mimicking compounds to attract beetles or ants, but none that used bees. There were fungi that grew on trees and released spores into the air, but none that altered hive loyalty. He found mentions of cordyceps species that controlled insect movement, turning living hosts into carriers, but that was fatal to the host, not cooperative like this. Nothing fit. Every answer led to another impossibility. Whatever was on that tree was either undocumented or something that had evolved beyond known classification. He took another sample, this time from a root like extension clinging to the bark lower down. Under magnification, it showed branching cells structured like mycelium, but thicker, denser, and extraordinarily elastic. The strands did not simply absorb moisture. They pulsed with it. Every cut section continued to twitch for hours after separation, as though still receiving a signal from the main body. He stored the new samples in sealed glass, labeling each with time and date. And yet, even sealing them away, he felt the wrongness of it lingering. A sense that this was not something humans were meant to examine under lamplight, because it belonged to processes older and quieter than human classification. But the worst part was not the fungus. It was what was happening to the bees. They no longer returned to the original hive boxes except to carry material out. The queen in his managed hive was still alive, but almost completely abandoned with fewer than a tenth of the workers tending her. When he opened the hive lid one morning, he found comb cells half destroyed, larvae half developed, and no honey in the upper frames. The bees had removed their own resources and delivered them to the fungus. They were dismantling their own home in order to build another. That afternoon, Henry made the decision to call the agricultural extension agent in town. Not to report a danger he didn't yet know what to call it, but to ask for identification. He described the growth as a large fungal mass on a pear tree attracting bees unnaturally. He spoke carefully, choosing words that sounded scientific instead of desperate. When the agent replied, the tone was patient but distant. Pear trees commonly hosted fungal infections, she said. Bees were drawn to sap leaks sometimes. If he wanted, he could send a picture and they would file it for review. That was all. No urgency, no visit, another farm problem, another wait time. When he hung up the phone, he knew two things with clarity. First, no one would take him seriously until the problem became visible to someone other than him. Second, by the time that happened, it would no longer be a problem. It would be a condition. He did not tell Anna everything. He mentioned the fungus, the odd behavior of the bees, but not the full scope, not the pulsing interior, not the roots spread forming under the bark, not the strange growth found in the workshop sample. He watched her tend the kitchen herbs in the windowsill and felt a guilt that settled like stone behind his ribs. He was keeping the truth back, not because he didn't trust her, but because he knew what kind of fear it would bring, and fear made bad decisions come faster. So instead, he went about the days like a man balancing two lives. The visible one where he repaired a fence and fed the cattle and checked the eggs, and the hidden one where every action was calculated around the thing growing on the tree and the clock ticking toward winter. But the fungus did not wait quietly. On the 5th day of observation, Henry found a second growth, not large, not fully formed, but unmistakable. A smaller, not of the same fibrous material beginning to swell from the base of a nearby plum tree about 30 yards from the pear. It was no bigger than a fist, but it had the same texture, the same faint vibration, and 3 bees already tending to it. Not random, not accidental, the organism was spreading. He marked it in his notebook, drew a perimeter line, and wrote a single word beside it. Phase. That night, he stood at the edge of the orchard, lantern in one hand, and imagined the growth pattern mapped like infection in a bloodstream. Trees were not separate organisms in soil. They were connected by micro-root systems, shared fungal networks, moisture exchange. If the fungus was traveling through the root systems beneath them, it could colonize every tree in the orchard before winter. And with every new growth, the bees would divide further, shifting allegiance, multiplying the threat. The farm was not simply losing bees. It was losing hierarchy. And still, not one neighbor had noticed. Not one official had asked a second question. Not one person outside the property knew how quickly the situation was advancing. The land around him looked calm, unchanged, and that illusion was the greatest danger of all. In the second week, Henry finally reached the point of the question he had been pushing away since the beginning. Should he destroy the fungus now while he still had the chance? Burn the tree, smoke out the bees, wear full gear, and take the risk. End it before it rooted into soil and before the herd suffered more. But every time he pictured doing so, he pictured the retaliation, the black cloud of thousands of bees swarming at once. Not confused, but coordinated, not panicked, but purposeful. One misstep, and he might not survive the attack. He had seen what a full colony assault could do to a man. He had treated the welts himself years ago. One sting was pain, dozens were warning, hundreds were death. And this time, the bees would not be defending honey or queen. They would be defending something they had already chosen as central to the colony's existence. He began preparing smoke tools, checking old veils, sharpening the hatchet, storing gasoline in sealed containers in the shed. He was not committed to the action yet, but he was done pretending he wouldn't need to act at all. The choice was becoming a calculation of sacrifice. Lose bees and risk injury now, or lose the farm in stages over months. Stand against the organism alone or watch it quietly expand until no one could stop it. That night he walked the perimeter of the field with a flashlight, the beam catching impressions in the ground. Another set of tire tracks too narrow to be from his truck. Footprints near the fence line. The faint imprint of something that looked like a wheeled dolly, the kind used to transport crates. No one had permission to be on his land. No one had asked. No one had been seen. But someone had been here. He took pictures. He made notes. He placed empty cans on strings across the back gate as improvised alarms. It was all he could do. The police had done their version of an inspection, but their circle of interest didn't reach the details Tom saw because no one else had lived on this land as long as he had. No one else could tell the difference between a tire mark made by a tractor and one made by a van. And then the first threat arrived. It wasn't dramatic, just a plastic grocery bag left hanging from the gate post the next morning. Inside was a dead sparrow with a broken neck. No note, no symbol, just the unmistakable message that Tom had stepped into something he was not meant to see, not meant to speak about, and not meant to survive if he made the wrong choice. His wife found it before he did. That was the part that made it feel different. Not like intimidation, but like intrusion. They weren't warning him. They were reminding him they already knew where he lived, what he cared about, and how to reach him without being noticed. The fear in his family's eyes hurt more than the threat itself. The police took the bird away as evidence, but the look they gave him afterward was worse than silence. It said they had seen this before. It said they had no way to protect him from it. By afternoon, Tom had been questioned again by 2 different federal officers, this time with sharper phrasing, fewer courtesies, and more emphasis on the timeline of his actions. They weren't accusing him outright, but they were preparing the structure of an accusation, the kind that could be used in court if cooperation ever turned into hostility. He understood the implication clearly. If he failed to help them, they would have every reason to assume he was involved. And if he helped them too much, the people who had put the capsules in the pumpkins would see him as a liability. There was no place left to stand that wasn't dangerous. But danger, he realized, was not the same as helplessness. He still knew the land better than anyone. He still knew which areas of the farm no police officer or agent had checked, and he still knew where someone might stash supplies if they needed to move quickly under cover of darkness. He walked to the far edge of the property as dusk settled, the fog returning like a memory of the morning before. There, hidden behind an overgrown tree line and nearly swallowed by weeds, stood a small storage shed no one ever used anymore. The padlock was old, the wood blistered, the hinges rusted, but the earth around the door was disturbed. Fresh tracks led to it. The weeds were pushed flat. Someone had been here recently. That was when Tom understood something that changed everything. The police had searched the pumpkins, but not the land. The FBI had investigated the immediate crime, but not the larger pattern. The criminals had used the farm not because it was convenient, but because it was trusted. He had been thinking like a farmer. He needed to start thinking like the people who had turned his field into a shipping line. He needed to investigate, not wait. For the first time since the nightmare began, Tom didn't feel only cornered. He felt something closer to purpose. Fear could not protect his family. Caution could not fix what had been done. The only path forward was to find out who was using his land and how deep the operation went. As he returned to the house, he passed the taped-off pumpkins and the floodlights the agents had left running through the night. He didn't look at them the way he had the day before. He didn't see fruit or loss or evidence. He saw a map, a pattern, a trail that ran through his field like veins under skin, carrying something meant to poison far more than soil. He wasn't waiting anymore. He would track the next step before someone else erased the trail. Inside the house, he gathered a notebook, a flashlight, gloves, and a camera. The shed would be the first place he checked. Then the tree line. Then the far ridge by the old fence post where he'd once found broken glass that didn't come from any jar he had ever owned. He didn't know yet who was behind this or how long they had been operating or what the capsule was intended to do. But he knew now that every answer was still on his land, and he was the only one who could find it before the people who planted it returned to cover their tracks. The night closed in around the farm as he stepped out again, alone, but no longer unsure. Whatever had started here wasn't finished, and neither was he. Tom left the house that night without telling his wife where he was going, though she could read the truth in his face as clearly as if he had spoken it. She didn't try to stop him. She only asked when he would be back. He didn't answer because he didn't know. He had crossed a line the moment he told himself he couldn't rely on the police or the federal agents. Now, every step he took was on territory no one could protect him from. Not the law, not the people behind the operation, and not even the land he had spent his whole life trusting. The shed stood at the far end of the property, half swallowed by brush, too far from the house to be seen from any window. The padlock was rusted, the kind that should have resisted movement. But when Tom lifted it, it clicked open too easily. Someone had replaced the inside pin. It was the kind of change no one would notice unless they had touched that lock for 20 years. He pushed the door open and felt his throat tighten. The interior no longer smelled of dust and old fencing wire. It smelled of chemicals, sharp, plasticky, the kind used in packaging plants and industrial sealants. The floor was littered with scraps of material he had never owned. Narrow coils of synthetic thread, pieces of heat-resistant plastic, and a roll of metallic tape. A pair of latex gloves was draped over a crate. Next to it was a spool of twine identical to the kind he had found stuck to the inside of the tampered pumpkins. And in the corner, stacked neatly as if waiting for the next visit, were flattened cardboard boxes printed with a barcode and the letters SB, no brand name, no seller address, no purchase order. His heart didn't race. It dropped heavy as a stone. This wasn't carelessness. This was storage. He took pictures of everything, cataloging it the way the agents might have done if they had bothered to look deeper than the pumpkins themselves. When he finished, he crouched to examine the dust near the entrance. The footprints were fresh, not boots, running shoes, different sizes, at least 2 people. The marks led out of the shed in a direction that didn't connect to the gravel drive or the barn, but toward the tree line, where a narrow path cut through the grass, a path that had never been there before the past week. Someone had been moving through his property like it was a corridor. He followed the trail through the trees, keeping his light low, listening for anything other than the sound of his own steps. The ground dipped into a shallow trench that ran parallel to the fence and then rose again near the edge of the old service road. He remembered the road as a child, once used for deliveries and later cracked and abandoned when larger highways redirected traffic. The town had stopped paving it a decade ago. It was the perfect place to enter land unseen. At the bottom of the trench, half buried in leaves, was a strip of plastic sheeting, the same kind used to wrap pallets in a truck. Someone had hidden their movements, protected the cargo, and left nothing exposed to the soil. It confirmed what he feared. This wasn't the beginning of the operation. It was the middle of it, maybe the end. He followed the trench upward until he reached a point where the trees thinned. Through the branches, he could see the faint outline of the abandoned warehouse on the other side of the service road. It had once belonged to a local lumber company, shut down years ago after bankruptcy. The roof had collapsed in places, and the windows were boarded. No one had reason to be there. No one except the kind of people who needed to hide something in plain sight. His pulse steadied, not from calm, but from decision. He would go inside. The warehouse door was chained, but not locked, an illusion of security. One tug from a bolt cutter would free it. Inside, the air was thick with dust, but not entirely still. Someone had been here recently. A light source had been used. There were faint burn marks from a portable lamp. He stepped deeper, shining his flashlight along the floor where tire tracks formed shallow crescents in the dirt. They didn't belong to cars. They were 2 narrow dollies, transport carts. He'd seen the same wheel width in the marks behind the shed. Further in, he found the staging area, a wooden table covered with flattened pumpkins, each one split open with surgical precision. The insides had been scraped clean and replaced with white residue shavings of hardened plant resin, the same adhesive used to seal the pumpkins afterward. Next to the table were stacks of vacuum bags, some empty, others still holding residue from narcotic packaging. The equipment wasn't homemade. It was professional, portable, and efficient. And then he found the ledger, a thick notebook with no cover, just page after page of dates, weights, codes, and initials. Not names, never names, but numbers he recognized from his own shipment records. Someone had recorded every pumpkin used, every concealed package, every retrieval date. And buried 3 pages in was an entry that made the entire operation widen into something far beyond drug trafficking. Code 7B4112CT marked B, deliver pre-Halloween. 12 pumpkins marked B, the same letter stamped on the capsule he had found. That meant the drugs were not the end of the operation. They were the camouflage for something worse. The cocaine inside the pumpkins had been designed to distract, to explain the weight, to give law enforcement a reason to stop looking once they found it. No one was supposed to cut open the second pumpkin. No one was supposed to find the capsule. And no one was supposed to be alive long enough to ask questions about what it was meant to do. He took more pictures. Every page, every code, every piece of evidence he could carry. It wasn't until he closed the notebook that the silence in the warehouse changed. A creak near the entrance, not with settling. Footsteps. Tom ducked behind a stack of crates, killed the flashlight, and held his breath. The steps were slow, cautious, not panicked. Whoever was entering wasn't afraid of being caught. That meant they believed they were alone. That meant they had been here before. A thin beam of light swept across the floor. It paused near the table, near the ledger, still slightly disturbed from where he had moved it. The person stiffened. The flashlight rose. Tom moved backward as slowly as he could, feeling the outline of a side door he had passed earlier. If he was lucky, he could exit without being seen. If he wasn't, the flashlight cut across the crates and stopped just before reaching him. He froze, knowing that even the slightest movement could catch the light. The person exhaled softly, lifted the ledger, flipped through the pages, and made a low sound of irritation. Tom heard a cell phone vibrate, muffled by a pocket, followed by a voice too low to make out words. A second voice responded farther away outside the warehouse near a vehicle. There were two of them, and he knew now without question that they weren't delivering anything tonight. They were cleaning up. The ledger snapped shut. Tom waited until the footsteps faded toward the far loading door. He slipped out the side exit and ran through the trees, keeping low, not daring to use the flashlight. Only when he reached the fence line of his own property did he stop running long enough to breathe. By the time he made it home, his hands were shaking. Not from exertion, but from clarity. He had found proof. Proof of the drug operation. Proof of the tampered pumpkins. Proof of a second cargo meant for an entirely different purpose. But he had not found what the capsule contained, or who was behind the financing, or why his farm had been chosen. And as he stood at the edge of the porch, he could see the house had been disturbed again. A chair on its side, a porch light unscrewed, a shadow of intrusion, not vandalism. Someone had been close enough to study the doors, close enough to test the silence inside. He entered the house quietly, checked every room, then the backyard, then the barn. Nothing missing, nothing taken, nothing broken, but someone had been there. He didn't need a note this time. The message was already clear. They knew he had gone looking. They knew he had seen something he wasn't supposed to see. He couldn't give the evidence to the local police. He couldn't trust the officials who were already convinced he might be involved. And he couldn't wait for the investigation to play out. Not when the people who had infiltrated his land were already watching him more closely than the agents were. He needed someone outside the circle. Someone not tied to the county, not tied to the sheriff, not tied to the people who were protecting the staging area at the warehouse. He remembered the name of one FBI agent who hadn't treated him like a suspect during questioning. An agent who had taken time to explain procedures, not intimidate him. Someone who had quietly slipped him a card, almost as if anticipating what might happen if the investigation was mishandled. He found the card in the drawer under the phone. He stared at it, weighing the risk of calling one person within the same agency that had already seen pieces of the truth. But if he did nothing, the people behind the pumpkins would finish their work long before the government finished its paperwork. He dialed the number. The agent didn't answer. The voicemail didn't identify the government office, only a tone. Tom kept his voice steady, but not vague. Something had been missed. Something was still active. He had proof. He had photos. He had routes and timestamps. He hung up. He pulled out a second envelope and filled it with printed photos along with a written statement of everything he had discovered. He sealed it and wrote the name of a local reporter he trusted. Not for now, for when there was no other way left to reveal the truth. Before bed, he went to the attic and hid the envelope behind a loose board. If those men came back during the night, they would not find it. He slept lightly, waking at every sound, every shift of wind, every creak of wood settling under the cold. But it wasn't fear that kept him awake anymore. Fear had already done its part. Now something stronger had taken its place. Resolve, heavy and sharp as a blade. Whatever this was, whoever was behind it, however dangerous it had become, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. They had made a mistake by choosing his farm, and he was done being the one who didn't see what was happening. The night after Tom made the call, he waited for a response that didn't come. He checked the phone more times than he cared to admit, half expecting the agent to return the call and half expecting an unknown number to appear instead, the kind that never left voicemail because it didn't need to. When morning arrived, it brought only silence and a gray sky rolling in from the west like a slow-moving storm. The house felt too still. His wife moved through the rooms quietly, speaking only when necessary, watching their daughter with the worry of someone who had already imagined the worst. Tom understood. The danger was no longer invisible. It was present in every creak of the porch, every unattended truck that slowed when passing the farm, every anonymous vehicle idling near the turn to the service road. The farm, once an open place, now felt like a trap. It wasn't until late morning that the phone finally rang. The number was not the one from the agent's card, but the voice on the other end identified herself as his colleague, speaking on a secure line. She didn't waste time with introductions. She only confirmed she had received the message, reviewed the photos, and wanted to meet in person. Her tone did not carry suspicion, only urgency. They arranged to meet 3 miles outside town at a rest area overlooking the river where no one would question parked cars. Tom left the farm in a truck that looked older than its engine, hoping it wouldn't draw attention. On the way, he checked his mirrors more often than he watched the road ahead. The agent arrived in a nondescript government sedan, not marked, but not pretending to be anything else. She looked younger than the others he had met, too thoughtful to be blindly procedural, too observant to waste time with small talk. She accepted the photographs, reviewed the notebook entries, and asked questions that made it clear she understood the difference between a frightened man and someone who had stumbled into something worth burying. She confirmed what Tom already suspected, that the local FBI office had received pressure to reduce the scope of the investigation, that the discovery of narcotics had satisfied the minimum threshold of action, and anything beyond that would require more proof, more risk, more political inconvenience. She was not part of the local office. She was here because someone else had passed her the message. Tom saw in her the first ally who didn't assume he was the moral center of a crime or a liability to a case. She saw a witness who refused to drown quietly. Together, they structured a plan. Not a dramatic one. No arrests, no raids, no direct confrontations. Not yet. They would collect more evidence, confirm the route of distribution, and intercept the next movement of the disguised pumpkins before they reached their intended destination. If they could secure a full shipment, one containing both the narcotics and the capsules, the case would force federal action from higher authority. Tom agreed, not because he wanted justice, but because he wanted the people behind this to be visible, not shadows with keys to his land. The night that followed felt different from the others, not lighter, but focused. The agent's team secretly installed cameras at the abandoned warehouse, placed a tracking device on the transport route leading from the service road, and positioned unmarked vehicles beyond the ridge where no one from the farm could be connected to the surveillance. Tom did his part. He returned to the field, checking for new disturbances, mapping the weight of pumpkins left untouched, confirming the subtle markers carved into certain stems. By evening, everything was in place. But the closer the hour came, the more Tom sensed something he hadn't anticipated. The criminals were changing their rhythm. He could feel it in the stillness of the field, the absence of motion where there should have been examination or retrieval. He didn't know how he knew, only that people who hid things this well were also people who knew how to disappear before anyone reached them. He stayed up late, sitting on the porch steps, listening for any sound that didn't belong. It came just after midnight. Faint but recognizable. The low rumble of an engine designed not to draw attention. The rustle of wheels moving over grass instead of road. The deliberate quiet of people who assumed no one was watching. But someone was watching. Not just Tom. Federal eyes were now watching too. He texted the agent the signal. They'd agreed upon movement on the field. Within minutes, she confirmed her team had detected activity near the warehouse. Then came a second message. They weren't loading. They were clearing. It took him a moment to understand. They were not retrieving pumpkins for distribution. They were removing evidence. Something had spooked them. Maybe they knew about the hazmat testing on the capsule. Maybe they had seen the police cars coming and going. Maybe someone inside law enforcement had warned them to shut down the operation. That possibility chilled Tom more than anything he had discovered in the shed. He told the agent where the transport trail left the property. She confirmed her team was moving to intercept, but the wording changed. No longer a planned operation, but a salvage attempt. The criminals were leaving, abandoning the warehouse and the field, taking what they could before disappearing behind whatever connections had protected them so far. 3 vehicles were detected on the warehouse cameras. 1 van, 1 box truck, 1 pickup. They weren't careless. They burned the documents they didn't need. They stripped the workbenches. They smashed equipment instead of leaving it. They took only sealed freight pumpkins that had already been prepared, loaded, and marked for delivery. It was all happening faster than Tom had imagined, faster than the federal team had planned for. And before anyone could respond, the agent sent the message no one wanted to write. "We have a leak." Tom read the words twice, feeling the full weight of them settle in his chest. Someone within the investigation had warned the very people they were trying to catch. Someone with access to evidence, access to the sealed scene, access to the details only investigators knew. There was no way the criminals would have known which pumpkins were still safe and which were compromised unless someone had told them. The agent didn't say who she suspected, but Tom didn't need her to. There were only a handful of officials who had seen the seized capsule. Only a handful who knew the FBI lab was running tests. Only a handful who had authority to shift the case downward instead of upward. Someone high enough to redirect an investigation, but low enough to disappear if anything went wrong. The operation collapsed in real time. The warehouse was half emptied by the time the unmarked cars arrived. The criminals scattered before the first arrest could be made. 1 man was taken into custody, but he refused to speak. The trucks were stopped miles apart, but only one contained pumpkins. Not the pumpkins they needed, not the ones marked for Halloween, not the ones with the capsules. The criminals had already moved the real shipment. Tom waited for morning with a heavy certainty, the kind that scraped at the inside of the ribs. He didn't blame the agent. She had tried, but what they had run into was larger than a hidden operation on farmland. This was a chain of people protected by someone who stood far enough from the ground to avoid suspicion, but close enough to the money to benefit from it. The sun rose on a burned corner of the warehouse, shattered equipment, and a half-missing ledger. The farm received no relief. The people behind the pumpkins were still unknown. The capsule still held its secret, and now there was no doubt left. The safety of the investigation had been compromised. The safety of Tom's family had been compromised. The truth was no longer an objective. It was a risk shared between too few people and valued by none of the ones in power. And then, as if to underline what had already been shown with silence and shadows, Tom returned home to find something waiting for him on the front step. A stone, a small one, clean, but heavy, wrapped in paper with a single line written in ink. "You're done now. Stay done." There was no anger left in Tom by then, only clarity. These people didn't threaten twice. They threatened once, then acted. If he walked away, they would move forward with their plan and vanish again. If he didn't walk away, they would trade caution for finality. But the choice was not about safety anymore. It was about who controlled the truth, those who used it as a weapon or those who refused to bury it. He picked up the stone, turned it over in his hand, and dropped it into the dirt. He would not be done. Not until the people who planted poison in pumpkins were no longer protected by power and silence. Not until someone besides him understood what was coming. Not until the truth was too public to kill. The threat left on the doorstep did not change Tom's decision. It only confirmed that he no longer had the illusion of safety to lose. The operation on his farm was shutting down. The criminals were already shifting into escape, and the people meant to investigate them had fractured from inside. If he backed away now, the trail would disappear. The evidence would be dismissed, and whatever had been planned for Halloween would happen as quietly as the pumpkins had been filled. The only way to stop it was to make the truth too loud to be ignored. The first step was to remove the story from the people who wanted it controlled. The packet he had hidden in the attic, the one containing the photographs, the notes, the evidence he had gathered when no one was watching, was no longer a backup. It was the front line. He added the newest pieces, the ledger pages from the warehouse, the photos of the tampered pumpkins still untouched in the field, the timestamps proving movement after the quarantine. He sealed the envelope and drove it himself to the town's small post office where he mailed it directly to the investigative journalist he trusted. Not a local news anchor, not someone who took state money, someone who understood that a story with no permission was the only kind worth publishing. From there, he returned to the farm and called the agent. She didn't answer at first, and he feared she had been silenced the same way the operation had been. But she called back 30 minutes later, speaking in a clipped tone that told him she was moving quickly, not freely. She had taken his information and brought it outside the jurisdiction of the compromised office. A federal prosecutor in another district had agreed to review the case if there was enough evidence to force escalation. So Tom gathered the rest. That afternoon, he walked the field for the last time, not as a farmer, but as a witness restoring the truth. He photographed every marked pumpkin still in the soil, every stem with the razor-thin incision, every row that had been tampered with. He documented the trench lines where carts had moved, the tire tracks leading toward the service road, the boot print near the shed door. He left nothing undocumented, not the smallest scrap of adhesive, nor the torn drop cloth near the fence. As he worked, he felt the field shifting in meaning. The earth he had spent a lifetime turning for food now turned against what had been hidden inside it. The pumpkins were no longer harvest, or loss, or shame. They were proof, and proof was the only thing that could cut through the silence of power. By evening, he had filled 2 hard drives with files. One he kept, one he sent with the agent. A third he stored in an off-site safe deposit box in a town no one associated with him. He understood now that truth was not protected by being held. It was protected by being impossible to erase. The agent called again 3 hours after sunset with the update he had been hoping for, not the end of the case, but the beginning of the unavoidable part. Based on the evidence he had provided, a multi-agency team had agreed to conduct coordinated raids on 3 linked sites. A warehouse near the state line, a storage facility registered to a shell company connected to the same serial codes, and a shipping terminal where a flagged cargo lot was scheduled to move on Halloween morning. It was no longer an internal investigation. It was a federal operation. Tom stayed awake through the night, receiving fragments of information as the raids unfolded. One location was hit first, with several low-level couriers detained and narcotics seized in bulk quantities. The second was slower, more resistance, more damage. The third was the priority. It held containers that had already cleared paperwork, already been placed under routine inspection status, already prepared for distribution. The containers were seized. The manifest confirmed what he had feared. Capsules, not drugs, were listed in coded form under agricultural documentation, enough to contaminate thousands of people if opened in a public space. That finally was the point where the investigation could no longer be redirected, buried, or quietly dismissed. There was footage. There were seizures. There were arrests on record. The case would go upward whether anyone wanted it to or not. But the names at the top, the financiers, the facilitators, the officials who had allowed the shipments to move without interference, were not in handcuffs. Not yet. One of them had already issued a public statement condemning the criminal infiltration of the agricultural sector. A statement so polished that Tom could hear the lie in every sentence. The man wasn't defending the truth. He was defending his distance from it. Soon that distance would shrink. The next morning, the article went live. Tom knew it the moment his phone began vibrating nonstop. The journalist had published everything: photos, quotes, timelines, testimony, shipping codes, capsule descriptions, copies of the ledger pages, satellite images of the warehouse, and a paragraph identifying the suspicious behavior of the local sheriff's office and the delay in reporting to federal authorities. The story spread faster than any investigation ever could. Within an hour, news networks were calling the farm, not to accuse Tom Hill of criminal activity, but to ask how long he had known, how he had discovered it, how he had protected the evidence when the first authorities failed to. It did not clear him of suspicion in every mind, but it changed the burden of proof. The question was no longer, was he involved, but how deep does this go? He declined all interviews. He had done what he needed to do. The proof was no longer his burden to carry. When the agents returned to the farm, they did not come with caution tape or gloves. They came to secure the remaining pumpkins as federal evidence and formally clear the land for civilian use again. The capsule found in the second pumpkin was confirmed by laboratory analysis to contain a controlled biological toxin, not airborne, but fast-acting if ingested. It was designed to spread through food, not through breath. Pumpkins cut into candy bowls at school fairs. Pumpkins baked into pies. Halloween had not been chosen for symbolism. It had been chosen for convenience. The farm was no longer a crime scene. But it didn't feel like a farm yet, either. The pumpkins sat in the field like markers of what had almost happened. What would have happened if Tom had never sliced the first one open? The agent came in person that evening, not in an official capacity, but as someone who had become part of the aftermath. She gave him the confirmation that no one else had delivered yet. The case was now protected under federal jurisdiction, and the people who had tried to bury it had failed. She thanked him the way one might thank someone who had done something necessary but unwanted, painful, but irreplaceable. He didn't feel like a hero. He didn't feel like a survivor. He felt like a man who had lived through something that had taken more than it gave back. The losses were still real. The harvest was gone. The season was ruined. The debts would not disappear because the truth had come to light. The field would need to be replanted with more than seed. But something else happened in the days that followed, something he had not expected. The people from town who had avoided him before now stopped by the farm with lumber, with supplies, with checks folded into handshakes. Not apologies. Actions. The kind that said they couldn't undo the silence from before, but they weren't going to let the farm rot under the memory of it. The house filled slowly with sounds that had been missing for too long: hammering, voices, the scrape of tools. Not celebration, restoration. When the last of the pumpkins were removed from the field, Tom stood alone among the empty rows. The soil looked raw again, bare and honest, without the weight it had carried for months. He knelt and turned the earth with his hand, the way he had done as a child beside his father. He found one pumpkin the agents had missed. Not marked, not tampered with. Not part of the operation, a perfect one. He cut it open. Inside there was nothing but seeds and pulp. Nothing but what nature intended. He didn't smile, but the knot in his chest loosened. The land was his again. Not untouched, not unchanged, but his. There would be another planting season. There would be another harvest. There would be new risks, new debts, new choices. But there would not be silence. Not again. The truth had cost him, but losing it would have cost more. And when he stood up and looked across the field, he did not see what had been done to his farm. He saw what would grow there next. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. There are even more shocking, unbelievable true story narrations waiting for you. So, check out the next video right after this. And if this one surprised you, share it with someone who loves a good mystery. Let's see what they think happened. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.